to maintain her composure, but it was clear she was losing control. The courtroom watched as her carefully crafted image crumbled before their eyes. Her lawyers made one last desperate attempt to defend her, claiming that all the accusations were politically motivated. But the evidence was too strong. The jury and the audience could see the truth. She had abused her power for personal gain, while the people of Dalton suffered. As the trial went on, Henyard sat in silence, her confidence gone. What once seemed like an unshakable political career was now in ruins. The same people who had once cheered for her were now whispering about her downfall. The judge called for order in the courtroom, and the trial continued. But one thing was clear. This was not just about legal charges. It was the dramatic fall of a leader who had once been seen as untouchable. To keep control, but it was clear from the shock and anger in her eyes that the weight of the accusations was getting to her. As the trial continued, it became clear that Henyard was a corrupt politician whose greed had hurt the very people she was supposed to serve. The pressure finally overwhelmed her. When the judge called for a recess, Henyard's frustration erupted. Known for her ability to command attention, she stood up suddenly and challenged the legitimacy of the proceedings. In a dramatic outburst, she screamed, "This whole thing is a political conspiracy against me." Her voice echoed through the courtroom, and the room tensed as the jury exchanged uneasy glances. Her legal team rushed to calm her, but it was clear she had lost control. "I'll walk out of here," she yelled defiantly, turning toward the door, expecting to leave the courtroom. But the judge wasn't going to let her escape so easily. Court officers quickly stepped in, but Henyard's outburst showed just how much pressure she was under. She was no longer the calm, confident politician who once ruled Dalton's political scene. She was now a woman on the edge, unraveling before everyone's eyes as Henyard tried to leave the room. Buzzed with disbelief, reporters scrambled to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It had become a public reckoning for a woman who had once been untouchable. The anger in the room was palpable, and Henyard, who had once thrived on power and confrontation, now seemed vulnerable and unprepared for the consequences of her actions. Was this the end for Tiffany Henyard? Could she recover from this public meltdown? Or was her reputation beyond repair? The people of Dalton were watching closely. It was clear their once unwavering faith in her leadership had been deeply shaken. The real question now was whether her supporters would continue to stand by her, as she seemed to believe, or whether they would demand accountability for the corruption she had left behind. What had started as a political trial quickly escalated into an emotional spectacle, and the public's reaction grew more intense by the minute. Henyard's supporters were dwindling while the number of people calling for her resignation continued to rise. The overwhelming evidence of corruption, combined with her emotional breakdown, only reinforced the growing perception that she was losing control, not just of the trial, but of her political future. As the trial went on, one thing became clear: Tiffany Henyard's days as mayor were numbered. The question wasn't whether she toward the federal agents. The tension in the room was palpable. Her once confident steps had now become hesitant, as if she was realizing that her entire world was crashing down around her. The courtroom, which had been filled with murmurs of disbelief, now grew completely silent as every eye followed her. As Henyard was led away, the reality of the situation settled in. This was no longer a political fight or a courtroom drama. It was a criminal investigation, and the charges against her were no longer just accusations. They were fast becoming a reality. The cameras continued to flash, capturing the moment that would define her legacy. One that had once been marked by power and respect, now reduced to scandal and disgrace. Henyard's supporters were divided. Some continued to shout that she was a victim of political revenge, but many more stood frozen, unsure how to react. The woman they had once believed in had been exposed as something completely different. Those who had once rallied behind her were now confronted with the painful truth that their faith in her had been misplaced. As the federal agents escorted her from the courtroom, Henyard tried one last time to hold on to her sense of defiance, her pride clinging to her like a fading hope. "You'll see, this isn't over," she muttered, though the words seemed empty now. The courtroom, once a place where she commanded attention, now felt like a stage for her final act. The fall of a once untouchable leader. Her career, her reputation, and everything she had worked for seemed to be slipping through her fingers. The people of Dalton who had once trusted her now faced the painful realization that their future which had once seemed so bright under her leadership, was now uncertain. The dream of progress had been overshadowed by corruption, and the woman who promised them a better tomorrow had become a symbol of their shattered hopes. Through the courthouse halls, cameras followed her every step, capturing the final moments of her once untouchable reign. Every step Henyard took, each flash of the camera, felt like another piece of her carefully curated image. Falling apart, her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, urging her to keep moving and maintain composure. But Henyard, her eyes blazing with defiance, stormed down the hallway. She pushed through the courthouse doors, still convinced she could salvage the situation, but it quickly became clear that her fall from grace was only just beginning. The true betrayal came from within her own ranks. A key witness, once one of her closest allies, stepped forward and turned against her. This confidant, who had helped cement Henyard's power, was now prepared to testify about the corruption, intimidation, and manipulation that had defined her time in office. The testimony was a bombshell. The room fell into stunned silence as the witness revealed that Henyard's reign wasn't just a political scandal. It was the collapse of a regime built on fear, deceit, and control. Henyard's face froze, a mixture of shock and rage. The gravity of the situation hit her like a freight train. She had always believed herself untouchable, relying on her influence and connections to shield her from any real consequences. But now, in front of the world, the truth was being laid bare. The walls were closing in, and her political empire was crumbling before her eyes. When the judge called for a recess, allowing both sides to regroup before the final decision, Henyard, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity. She thought this could. She was no longer in control. The weight of the situation, the pressure of the investigation, and the eyes of the world watching her every move made her realize that the shield of power and influence she had once relied on was gone. As the agent repeated his request for her to come with them, Henyard's body trembled with a mix of rage and fear. Her mind raced, but there were no words left that could save. As the agent repeated his request for her to come with them, Henyard's body trembled with a mix of rage and fear. Her mind raced, but there were no words left that could save her now. She had always been able to spin a narrative, to manipulate the room, to twist the truth in her favor. But now there was no spin, no deflection, just the cold, hard truth staring her in the face. Her attorneys, desperately trying to regain some semblance of control, urged her to cooperate, but Henyard could only stand frozen. The defiance she once held so tightly now crumbling under the pressure. She had fought so long and hard to get where she was. But now, as the federal agents moved to escort her out of the courtroom, she realized that all of it was unraveling. The room felt suffocating. The courtroom, once a place where she had commanded respect, now felt alien. The reporters' cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every moment of her fall from power. Those who had once celebrated her every victory now watched in stunned silence, unsure of how to reconcile the woman they had admired with the one they saw now cornered and exposed. Henyard's last desperate attempt to hold on to her narrative, to frame herself as a victim of political persecution, was met with cold indifference. Her words, once powerful enough to sway opinions and manipulate crowds, now seemed hollow, a desperate cry into the void. She was no longer the powerful political figure she had once been. The walls were closing in, and the forces that had once seemed so distant were now standing at her door, ready to take her into custody. The once proud mayor, who had once seen herself as untouchable, now stood in the stark reality that she was just another individual facing the consequences of her actions. As Henyard was led away, the world watched, and the final chapter of her political career was written not by the narrative she had tried to control, but by the undeniable truth of her own downfall. The situation was slipping through her fingers faster than she could regain hold of it. Outside, cameras clicked away, capturing the dramatic turn of events. Social media exploded with real-time reports. Hashtags like #Bora and #Yatran trended globally as the spectacle unfolded. Tiffany's loyal supporters, once unwavering in their faith, were thrown into chaos. Some loyalists screamed accusations of a setup attempting to fend off the agents, but others quietly began retracting their support, unable to ignore the growing scandal that now consumed their once beloved mayor. The room that had been Henyard's domain for years now felt foreign and hostile. The once unstoppable force, who had commanded every room she entered, was now rendered powerless. Her lawyer, ever the pragmatist, urged her to move forward with haste. Tiffany Henyard, her eyes blazing with frustration, ignored the advice of her lawyers, and stormed toward the courtroom doors flanked by federal agents. Every step she took was recorded, marking her public downfall. As she walked through the courthouse halls, each step felt like another blow to her pride. Detailed ledger, showing payments from multiple companies linked to shady dealings, including offshore accounts that had once seemed so far out of reach. Tiffany's eyes darted over the pages, her fingers trembling slightly as she processed the evidence laid out before her. The proof was irrefutable, and it was clear that her carefully constructed defenses were crumbling piece by piece. Her usual sharp retorts were gone, replaced by a growing sense of panic. The confident, unshakable woman, who had once commanded every room she entered, now seemed small and cornered. The investigator's calm, methodical approach was a stark contrast to Tiffany's increasing anxiety. "You can try to spin this however you want, Ms. Henyard," the investigator said softly, his voice calm but firm. "But the evidence is clear. The people you once claimed to serve, they deserve the truth." Tiffany clenched her jaw, but for the first time, the anger in her eyes wasn't enough to mask the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "This isn't what it seems," she muttered, though her words lacked the conviction she once carried so effortlessly. Outside, the public's anger was reaching a boiling point. The hashtags flooded social media, with users dissecting every new detail of the scandal and debating the severity of the charges. The once stalwart Henyard supporters were turning against her. What had started as whispers of corruption had now evolved into a full-scale public outcry. People were no longer questioning her actions, they were demanding accountability, and her power base was quickly evaporating. Protests erupted in Dalton as citizens marched, holding signs that read "Henyard must go," and "No more corruption." The once proud mayor, who had once stood as a symbol of power and pride for many in her community, was now the face of a scandal that threatened to shake the very foundation of her city. Back in the interrogation room, Tiffany's eyes fell onto the final document the investigator slid toward her. A set of wire transfers detailing large sums of taxpayer money moved into her personal accounts. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. There was nowhere left to run. Tiffany's hands were now trembling, and despite herself, she looked at the investigator. I didn't mean for it to get like this," she stammered, a sharp contrast to the fierce, unapologetic figure she had once been. The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, the weight of her actions sinking in. Her legacy, once built on power, trust, and political maneuvering, now lay in tatters. Her mind raced, but all her years of manipulating narratives, deflecting blame, and commanding statement, carefully crafted by her PR team, was released to the public, but it felt like an empty performance, an attempt to salvage what remained of her reputation. But the damage was already done. The public response was swift and unforgiving. Social media erupted with backlash, ridiculing her attempts to deflect the reality that was now too clear to ignore. The hashtags #HenyardFalls and #CorruptionUncovered flooded every corner of the internet. People were no longer interested in her words. They were demanding action. Outside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was one of complete chaos. News cameras followed every development, broadcasting her every misstep to a captivated audience. The city council, which had once stood as her ally, was now turning on her. The trustees' call for a forensic audit was a clear sign that the political tide had irrevocably shifted. For the first time in a long while, Tiffany Henyard was not in control. Her attorneys, who had once been fiercely loyal, were now nowhere to be seen. The people she had once relied on were distancing themselves, either too afraid or too disgusted to stand by her side. It was clear that the very foundation of her political career had been built on a web of lies, and now it was all coming apart in front of the world. The protests outside City Hall were growing in intensity. The signs demanding her resignation and arrest were impossible to ignore. Citizens who had once hailed her as a champion were now calling for her to face justice. Tiffany, once the face of power and authority, was now the face of scandal and corruption. Inside the interrogation room, her hands shook as she tried to maintain some semblance of composure. She had been the architect of her rise to power, but now, in the face of mounting evidence, she couldn't seem to find a way to stop the inevitable fall. The sworn affidavit from her former aide, once a trusted ally, was the final blow. The reality of her situation was undeniable, and yet she still clung to the faintest hope that she could find a way to salvage something from the wreckage. But deep down, Tiffany knew that her time was up. Her political career, her carefully constructed empire was gone. The people who had once trusted her had turned their backs, and there was no way to undo the damage that had been done. The walls were closing in on her, and the consequences of her actions were now unavoidable. As the investigators continued to press her, Tiffany's defiance started to fade. The sharp, arrogant tone that had once been her signature now felt like a distant memory. The woman who had once controlled every narrative, every room, was now struggling to control her own fate. The full weight of her actions was beginning to sink in, and no amount of spin could change what was happening. The investigation was no longer just about allegations. It was about exposing the truth. And the truth was that Tiffany Henyard's reign, once thought unshakable, had ended in humiliation. The fall of Tiffany Henyard, once a powerful and unassailable figure, was now unfolding at an unprecedented pace. Despite the mounting evidence against her, Henyard refused to back down. Her declaration that it was all part of a politically motivated attack only fueled the public's growing disdain for her. The internet was relentless, with users mocking her defiance and demanding she resign. But Tiffany, ever determined, held on to her narrative, hoping she could somehow turn the tide. She called a press conference, standing tall and proud before the cameras. Her voice was unwavering, but the cracks in her defense were becoming more evident. She lashed out at the media, at her political rivals, and at the federal government, accusing them of targeting her because she didn't follow their rules. But no matter how loudly she protested, the narrative had already shifted against her. The public was no longer buying her story. That night, after news stations wrapped up their coverage, a bombshell dropped. FBI agents, supported by state officials, executed a search warrant at Henyard's residence and workplace. This was the first time in history that federal agents had raided the home of a sitting mayor. The images of Henyard being escorted off her property in handcuffs, her once pristine image shattered, quickly went viral. The charges against her were severe: wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit bribery. Legal experts were quick to speculate that, if convicted, she could face over 20 years behind bars. As the evidence piled up, it became clear that a plea deal might be her only way to avoid the harshest punishment. The city, once divided between admiration and skepticism of Henyard, was now starkly split. Some celebrated what they saw as a long-awaited reckoning, while others were left in shock, unable to reconcile the woman they once trusted with the criminal activity now being revealed. By morning, her political future seemed uncertain, and her allies, once vocal in their praise, were now distancing themselves, some even calling for her immediate removal from office. The investigation did not end with her. Other officials tied to Henyard were now under investigation, deepening the scandal and further undermining the trust of the public. The city began preparing for a new chapter of leadership, uncertain of what the future held. But Tiffany's story was far from over. From behind bars, her lawyers issued one last defiant message on her bay.